Pacific Standard Time, in audio and video on Facebook Live, Periscope, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn Live, and YouTube. A conversation about life, entrepreneurship, personal development, family tech, and marketing. My name is Ivan Temelkov, and I'm your host. On this podcast, you will gather 100% real, raw, and unfiltered life-changing advice to help you level up in every aspect of your life and business and help you reach your goals and dreams. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special guest on this first version of the Overdrive by the name of Adam Adams. Adam, how's it going?
It's going well. Thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So Adam, also known in the real estate community as AAA, has devoted himself to educating and inspiring aspiring investors through real estate conferences, radio and podcast interviews, his program, and a thriving meetup group. He has been podcasting since 2017 and currently hosts the Apartment Investing Show with hundreds of thousands of downloads. His podcast is listened to around the world. His efforts to educate and inspire other investors earned him the prestigious title as Master Investor by Think Reality magazine, and is also a 3-time Hall of Fame winner of Rementor for the successes in multifamily syndications. Meetup.com has recognized Adam as one of the top meetup organizers in the world in 2018. Wow, man, that's quite the bio there.
I should shorten it. Adam is a nice guy, and and he helps people with podcasts, and does have a really awesome meetup group. At least when it's not COVID times. That should be the bio. Just really simple, right?
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with you with being concise, but I think that it adds depth to your story also, because personally, I'm a huge fan of people's stories, because I think it just goes to show the evolution of one from a personality and character standpoint. And with that being said, let's go back a little bit here and let's talk about, like, how did you get into real estate? How did you get into meetup? Let's go back to those times and tell us, how did you get into all of this? What enticed you?
So for real estate, it's been a lifelong thing just because my family are real estate investors. So I never stood a chance not to do it. My dad just wouldn't let me go any other route. So there's this book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad that I read that he was trying to make me read in 1997, literally when it came out. We owned the game Cash Flow that Robert Kiyosaki created, like back when it first came out as well. It's always been a thing. I never stood a chance to get out of it. My dad actually bought me a piece of land. Later on, his accountant made me pay for it, or else he was going to have some tax whatever. I'm not an accountant, so I don't know how it. But he had to make me pay for it, even though he wanted to give it to me. So I ended up investing in real estate in 2005. Was the first time. I was in college at the time. And when I sold it in 2007, I made a lot of money, more than I had ever made in any year of my life. Of course, I was still just a college student, but I made more in that one transaction than I ever did in a whole year of bartending and trying to put myself through college. So I thought it was really cool. That's where I decided I was going to finally read that book my dad always wanted me to read. And I got involved in multifamily investments, mostly as a side gig. Always starting businesses, doing more entrepreneurial stuff, and having real estate just be like this side thing. In 2016, it became full time for a while. 2016, 17, 18, I was doing only real estate. And in 2019, I started doing consulting, helping people to launch podcasts and meetup groups that could get ranked and have really good value. So that's kind of like the background. Right now, I still have real estate investments. I'm invested in 1,400 apartment doors, and a couple of single family rentals that I own as well. But so that's kind of where I am real estate wise. And then we have a lot of clients in like podcasting, which we take them from not being ranked and not getting like enough listeners or downloads or reviews or whatever to be able to start getting ranked, and helped a few people with the marketing of podcasts or marketing of meetups that they run to be able to get more attendees or more listeners, depending on what it is. It's been something that I enjoy marketing a lot. That's my favorite part. So been able to take people who already have these things or want to get into these things, those two, to just really level it up so that they're getting. I feel like a lot of people have a meetup group or have a podcast, right? And it's like they're putting effort into it, but they don't really have enough people coming to the meetup or enough listeners downloading the podcast. And so I've kind of niched with that marketing to put those in front of more people. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. So with the podcasting and the marketing part, is it primarily geared towards the real estate industry and real estate agents, or?
No, it's focused. What we do on the marketing for like a podcast, it is something that would work with any podcast at all. I guess I'd have to say, because I am more of an influencer in real estate. If you're in real estate, you probably know my name, like, because I have a podcast in it. We have coaching program in it. And so most people in real estate find who we are, but outside of the real estate, my name's not quite as like large. And so I tend to have a large amount of my clients come through there, and they're like, "Hey, Adam, I want to start a podcast for my investing career or whatever." But we have also got clients that one of them is a sexual, like, doctor of intimacy and sex, and we're working with a couple of attorneys that we have as clients that are launching podcasts or have one now. So yeah, it could be anything, honestly. And we've seen that when we help somebody kind of either launch a new podcast, or if they've got one for the last few years, we've been able to bring them so that they're now ranking on iTunes and things like that. So it's agnostic toward the industry, but a lot of people do find me through real estate as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had to ask because when it comes to podcasting, you're absolutely right. I feel like, it has become, or it's really veering more towards mainstream, because so many people have figured out, the podcasting is a great way to build awareness and build thought leadership and build authority, especially in the entrepreneurial space. If you want to develop your voice as well, it's a great way of doing that through podcasting. But, a couple of things that I think, 6 years later now, looking at the evolution of this podcast and the multiple rebrands that it has had, is the relatability and the relevance to the marketplace.
Yeah.
Which is a really big one, because you were talking about, and why I asked also if your podcast was geared towards the real estate spaces, because you have influence and authority in that space. So what most people do is say, hey, I'm a real estate person, so it might make sense to start a real estate podcast because I can attract more people in the real estate space,
Okay.
Whether it's...
And I might have misunderstood the question. I was thinking that you were asking the podcast clients that we work with if they're all in real estate. But I'll mention, I sold my first podcast. It was called Creative Real Estate Podcast. So I was able to sell and offload that to someone else who wanted to have a podcast that was already ranking, which was kind of cool because I had a few different offers, and one was 60,000. A couple were others were over 50 grand to sell the podcast. It was kind of neat to be able to just offload that to someone else for a price that I think worked out for me and for them.
Sure.
So that one was real estate only, and then I'm launched two other podcasts. One of them is not aired yet, but one is called the Apartment Investing Show, which does add value to just apartment investors. And what that does for us, like you were just mentioning, Ivan, is like it helps us to be able to get in front of passive investors like that want to be part of a syndication. So it helps us add value to them. And then I also am the one that's, as we're recording, it's not launched, but I'm sure it'll be launched. Most of the listener will know that it's already launched because I can just look for it. But it's called The Podcast on Podcasting. So yeah, it's literally the podcast helping podcasters become better influencers and market it better and launch it better so that they can really establish their listener base. So yeah, 3 different shows. One of them sold and the other 2 are fairly new.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate you definitely clarifying that. One other thing that you mentioned that I think is really important to recognize in the podcasting space too, specifically, is that, it's like really anything is this how you do things really differentiates yourself from everyone else. And with podcasting specifically, is like you said, even though you've worked with some people that, may have a pre-existing podcast, but helping them, get it ranked and get more visibility and more traffic and, higher listenership also, which I think, one of the biggest misconceptions in podcasting right now, and the fact that it's really veering into mainstream because, there's a lot of different platforms like Anchor.fm, I think is one that, is really like a 1, 2, 3 click to get a podcast or a mini cast started. But the reality of things is it's just that, it's kind of like you want to get something quick going. But if you want to evolve it and grow it, it's going to need a lot more attention to detail than that. And I think that's probably the biggest thing, right? Is just that the devotion and the little things that you fine tune that's going to help you get more traction that I think is really key for people to understand in this episode, because I know I personally have gone through those things with this podcast as it has evolved and morphed. And some of it had to do really with change of interest too, I mean, when this podcast started was the digital marketing revolution, 6 years ago. And it has really changed to the RAS project, which most people don't know that it stands for raw as shit. That's RAS. And the reason it's that is because that was actually going to be another name for the podcast. But let's just say that iTunes labels that as profanity. And being that direct and explicit and transparent and raw really is, yes, you can be, but no, you can't be, because there's still, confinements to like how you want to portray your podcast. So, but nonetheless, the point I was trying to make is that it's an evolution, or it has been for me, because there's been a change of interest, starting out from just marketing related to pivoting to entrepreneurship and life and personal development, because what I realized over the years is that it has always been a DNA thing for me. I'm an Eastern European, I'm an immigrant, my father is an entrepreneur. And so like a lot of these things were just ingrained in my personality and character. And, after several years, I realized that, what, like there's these strengths here that you just haven't utilized, and now it's time to really project them. And what better way than use your podcast to do that, to vocalize that. So one thing that I wanted to talk to you about is, so, as you work with different podcasting clients, what are some of the most common things that you run into with podcasts?
There's, I love that question. I wasn't prepared for it, but I do have a couple of answers. One thing that really surprised me that I get a lot of questions on with podcasting is how do I get good guests? Like I never would have thought of it myself, but it seems like brand new podcasters or aspiring podcast hosts they really are concerned if they will even be able to have guests. For me, it always seemed like a simple thing. I just reach out to them, offer value to them to come on the show, and it just seems that easy. So it's something that it's recurring, and I hear it all the time. How do I do this? How do I get there? So I thought that was interesting to point out, and I guess since it is such a common question, I'll try to share a little bit with your listener. Yeah, first off, Ivan and I, we met on Podbooker or Podcast Booker. I don't recall the exact name, but there's a .com for it, and that's kind of a cool place to reach out to good people and just say, hey, would you like to come on my show? A couple other tips that I've done because I wanted to get really big people on my show.
Yeah.
Is I know sounds silly, but this is actually how I've done it. Is I start by going on Facebook to see who their connections are. So I just look up this fairly famous person and see who their other connections are. And I don't friend them right now. A lot of times I'll see that there's people that are connected with them, and I'll start reaching out to like their friends and just saying, hey, I have this podcast. Let's just pretend like it's a real estate podcast since we've talked real estate a little bit. So I'll say something to their friends and I'll say, hey, I have this real estate podcast. Do you know anybody who should come on? And it's that simple. And they might keep referring to this person that they're friends with, and that's in the real estate space that might be an influencer that I felt like was untouchable. And of course, because they're all connected with this person, it's likely that many of them will point to that person. And so then I'll eventually go to the person and I'll friend that person and I'll say, by the way, John and Sarah and Amy and Paul all said that I should have you on my podcast.
Yeah.
Or would you be interested in making this happen? Because now it feels like more of a warm introduction. So I felt like that was a pretty cool way to do it. The other thing that I do is maybe I'll go to a Facebook community of real estate investors if I have a real estate podcast, and I'll just scroll through and look for people that are posting and commenting and adding value, and I'll personally reach out to them and I'll say, hey man, or hey, if it's not a man, hey person, I saw your comment on this one Facebook page, and I thought that was really insightful what you shared. And I just wanted to see if you would want to come and add value to my audience and talk a little bit more about that. And I just get tons of yeses. So it's always been fairly easy.
Yeah.
Another thing is, I feel like we shouldn't just have amazing people on the podcast. I feel like it's going to be good to have a variety of people on your show. And what I mean by that is some of the people that come on a show, I want them to be brand new in the industry. Maybe if it's real estate, they just did their first or second deal. Maybe if it's on my podcast about podcasting, right? Maybe I'll have some podcasters that are famous, but also a couple of podcasters that have only been doing it for a month or two. I like that because the newer guest really can resonate better with my audience because they're in the trenches of what the audience is really going to be going through at that time. And it's also nice to have the other person that has a ton of experience, has a huge list and everything, because that also helps a lot, inspires a lot, and adds a bit of credibility to the show. So I think that another takeaway for the guest is to have a variety of types of guests on your show. That seemed to help people to feel a lot more comfortable about getting there. What else? What else is, to answer your question, what else is a common thing? A common issue that I see a lot of people making is they're going with what's called ready, fire, aim. And I think that everybody's told that they should do ready, fire, aim. Everyone said gets told, like, if you overthink things, you might just never have it. And they're also being told, like, done is better than perfect. And I think what the issue is about really not thinking through launching a show, some of the issues are, for instance, one, if you go ready, fire, aim, maybe you don't truly understand who your avatar is. That means your listener. You don't understand who you're trying to attract, what and how that process is working. You haven't really thought through it. And so a lot of people, they just start a podcast without having the end in mind, and they're not sure who they're attracting, and they do it just a bad job. So that's a huge thing. And the other part is the marketing. So they go ready, fire, aim, and they just have a podcast, but they didn't ever market it. And so the benefit, or what you can do to fix those two things, is if you're going to start a show, you want to go ready, aim, fire. And during that aim time, that's you identifying your perfect listener and what you would do with them, and developing a marketing strategy. Because like people that work with us, the difference is you either have a podcast or you have a podcast with listeners, downloads, ratings, and reviews. And I feel like just having a podcast isn't enough. Ready, fire, aim. You want to ready, aim, fire, understand your avatar, market it, have that marketing plan to be able to get the listeners, the downloads, the ratings, and reviews, so that you have a show with a lot of credibility. And so that's kind of the big issue that I see most podcasters having, is they were told just ready, fire, aim, done is better than perfect, versus let's actually make sure that this serves somebody and that we get in front of that person that it serves. Because when you do that, you're going to get huge benefit, because iTunes, Apple Podcast will start doing your marketing for you. Most of my clients, when we launch, they get ranked into new and noteworthy. They get ranked top, 5 times better than the top 1% in a short amount of time. When that happens, iTunes is like pushing their podcast in front of more people, and they no longer have to do it, which it's night and day. You either have no listeners or tons of listeners. There's really no middle ground,
Yeah. Well, one thing that I wanted to elaborate on what you just mentioned in terms of, and those were all great tips. I 100% agree with everything that you said, especially when you said ready, fire, aim. I think it kind of goes back to, like, well, something's better than nothing. Well, true, something is better than nothing, right? But you still need to refine that something, to get better results, right? That's kind of like, trying to buy a Mercedes Benz in the Honda Civic budget and hope that it performs like a Mercedes Benz. It just won't. You're gonna have to throw some money into that Honda Civic to give it some more performance, and even then, it's not going to perform like a Mercedes Benz. So, one thing I actually wanted to mention is, talking about getting, when you were talking about those tips, something that I found that was really interesting is, so you mentioned about the value to capture caliber of influencers for your show, so guests. So 3 years ago, Elena Cardone was one of the guests on the podcast. And it was really interesting because that's probably one of the most influential stories that I remember, because it goes to what you were just saying. And what I found out is that when you share value, like you said, with some people that just get started out with podcasts, they're kind of questionable about guests. Like, how do I attract guests? Why would they want to come on my show? I don't even have an episode recorded, right? Well, that wasn't the case with me. But what I found in that experience is that, first of all, consistency builds trust. So literally for 2 weeks on Twitter, I bugged Elena Cardone in the DMs of just saying, hey, we'd love to have you on the podcast. This is going to be worthwhile. And I actually regret it to this day that I only did it in audio and I didn't do it in video. Actually, at the time, the RAS project was called the Human Business Narrative. That was one of the other names before I actually rebranded it, because human business is kind of the epicenter of everything I do in terms of digital and marketing. So the consistency of that 2-week span proved that, hey, Ivan is someone that I can trust. He shows up consistently. And that's really true in life and in business. I mean, if you develop that consistency, people know that they can trust you. So showing up in her DM every day was an indication of consistency. But then the other thing is the contextual value in the conversation. Like you could literally be just someone that just started a podcast yesterday, and but if you have an immense amount of value to share, perspective and knowledge and education, and lead with that, influential people will see that. And Elena is not the only one that's been on the podcast that's of that caliber. But in what you were saying, that's 100% true. I agree with that. And really, at the end of the day, is also, which I'm a believer of this, is just be yourself. Don't try to fabricate someone else. Just be yourself, and by being yourself, I mean, which by the way, being myself, real and raw, because that's who I am. Surprisingly, an F-bomb hasn't been dropped just yet in this conversation, but that was something that, for quite some time that I personally struggle with in really trying to appeal to what other people's perception was of the podcast versus what is my perception. What do I want to do? How do I want to craft and create this? What is this program going to look like? Not what everybody else wants me to make the RAS project, but how I want to shape the RAS project. What is it going to be about? So it really goes, to niching it down of like, what do you want your podcast to be about? Who do you want to attract? So I agree with you. Who's your buyer persona and your target audience, which really goes back to marketing. And then at the end of the day, I mean, you don't want to appeal to everybody. You only want to appeal to a certain amount of people, and so it's okay to be in the minority bucket, because I think everybody wants to be in the majority bucket because they want to create this mass exposure with their podcast specifically. And let's face it, that will happen, but in due time, when you accumulate enough exposure around the people that actually gravitate towards the context that you share. So that was the one thing I wanted to elaborate upon, because the tips that you shared are absolutely 100% on point. And in fact, anyone listening and watching to this episode that's, either started a podcast or, is looking to evolve their podcast, which by the way, iTunes or Apple Podcasts doing your marketing for you is actually kind of genius. Most people don't understand like how that actually works, because most people think that, hey, I got to market my podcast. Well, sure, to some extent, you got to share with people on your social networks and such. Like, hey, I got a podcast, because it kind of goes back to the saying that just because you build it, they won't come. I think that's a traditional, perception of like, from, well, not just a podcast, but in business, building a business, starting a business, that, hey, I've got a business, I got a podcast. So come and listen. Well, you got to tell the world also. But it is indeed, fascinating how Apple Podcast starts to promote that to you, because I actually have seen that. Speaking of that, is I was just doing a search this morning on the RAS project on Apple Podcasts, and I noticed that it's being in the entrepreneurship category, and others subscribe to Andy Frisella, Real AF, Ed Milet. I'm like, these are like power players. How do I even like get in here? And I know these guys too, in part, but like suddenly seeing your association with these other influential podcasts, like, it's rejuvenating, right? So it goes back to what you were saying, that Apple Podcasts does, start to promote and push your podcast, because it sees that you have value to offer. You create attraction. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, that's ultimately the key ingredient here, right? It's like the contextual value, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I took away a few points that you shared. One was I really liked that consistency builds trust. I think that works all over the board. Consistency and showing up and having a podcast builds trust with your audience, and doing it every Monday at 9 or whatever it is. If you get a schedule. It's good to keep that. And I liked how you use that to get, Miss Cardone on your show as well by reaching out to her daily. The Another takeaway that I got from you was to be yourself, and I think that's important. You mentioned you drop f bombs, and because that's your natural personality, that you're willing to be raw on the show. And I think regardless of who we are, if we are ourselves, I think we're really going to feel better about life and our business and our podcast, but also it really translates and allows others into our world by being congruent with who we are, so that they know what to expect. So if we are somebody who drops F-bomb, then it's good to just do that, because you're going that with you being who you are, I think it's really going to attract people. The third thing that I took away from what you said was niching down. And I always say, if you try to speak to everybody, then you're really speaking to nobody. If you're trying to be too broad, if you're trying to be out there for everyone, the truth is nobody can resonate with your message because you're being too broad. And so I love that, niche down. If you're trying to speak to everyone, you're really talking to no one. So find that niche. And the last one that I got from you just now is letting Apple promote you. And now it's difficult to do that. You have to promote you for really hard for the first few weeks. But if you promote you incredibly hard, it will allow you to be able to have Apple doing the work for you for then on. And I think that's a piece that most influencers, most podcasters miss. They are behind the eight ball kind of when they launch. They're doing the ready, fire, aim thing.
Right.
They don't have a plan. And what ends up happening is by the time that they could have had Apple start promoting them, they're so far behind that they're likely to give up. They're likely to have really no audience. But if they can promote themselves for the first 8 weeks, you are likely to be able to have it where Apple recognizes you because you're consistent, you show up, you're yourself, you're niching down, where Apple's going to be able to put you in front of those other people. So I think it's important to make that distinction. If you want Apple to promote you, you got to promote you, or hire something like my company. We do that promotion as well. Like hire somebody or do it yourself to make sure that you're getting out in front of audiences first, so that Apple's algorithms are hit. Because once you hack into the algorithms of Apple, now they're going to promote you. But you can't get there without actually starting it on your own. So I think it's important to kind of mention that. But I really liked everything that you said.
The couple other things that I wanted to mention actually real quick is that, and this really kind of goes back to really being unique, because I'm a firm believer that, if you want to separate yourself from the rest of the herd, just, be fucking unique. It's that simple. And I'm thinking back to probably 5 years ago. This was in the first year, when I started the podcast, and, it was the digital marketing revolution, and, been in this space for 26 years. Lots of trial and failure, self-taught for the most part, lots of agency experience. But I did the number one mistake in the first year that everybody else was doing when I started this. And that was that I was doing the same exact thing that everybody else was doing, literally. And what I mean by that is everybody was starting a podcast or thinking about a podcast, and I'm like, well, I'll just talk about digital marketing. Well, that's great and all, but what's your angle on this? I'm like, wait, Ivan, this kind of fucked up, because you're literally sharing the same value. There's no differentiation here whatsoever. What's the flair? What's the environment? Is there some humor? Is there some banter in this? Or is it like your typical, I was exchanging tweets with someone, yesterday on Twitter, and they were talking about humanization and human marketing, human business is something that I've focused on with my company, Razor Sharp Digital, for the last 5 years. And we're exchanging tweets, and he responded back and said, "Well, companies like State Farm and another one, have been humanizing business, for a while." I said, "Yeah, they have, but at the end of the day, it's the execution and the tactical approach that always creates the differentiation." So an example is like, Tesla was the first, all electric company, but they weren't definitely the first one to come up with an electric car. You see what I'm saying? And so like this goes back to the podcast, like uniqueness. And after the first year, it literally took several years to like pivot and change the mentality behind like what I want this to be. And in fact, even nowadays, and I think I mentioned this to you before we started recording, and even for one of my clients that I mentioned this, is we multi-stream in video on Mondays and Fridays, doing the podcast and live. Now we are on the RAS project, Overdrive. But what I noticed with that is when you're consistent in streaming same day, same time, and create that repetition, it builds trust with people. And suddenly, that's when you start building that audience. That's when your viewers start going up. But like, and honestly, when you think about it, it's such a small change, consistency, right? It's such a small change that you make, but it has such a huge impact. And by the way, I've struggled with this too, because I've had my plateau moments, like, 3 months I'll go off the radar and, my fucking stats would tank and I'll be like, what the hell happened, Ivan? Like, why'd you just stop publishing,
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to allude to that because these are all great tips that we're talking about here. You shared a lot of good ones too, that I firmly believe. And even nowadays, I think with podcasting really going more into like video. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed, but YouTube opened up a new category called video blogging or vlogging.
Okay.
And it's fairly new, but it's geared more towards like the vloggers as opposed to like people and blogs, which was the traditional category for most people on YouTube. But now you're even seeing podcasts, veering into the YouTube space. And the only last thing I wanted to mention too, that I think is important also, is cross-channel distribution. So like iHeartRadio and Pandora and Amazon, Google Podcasts, which they've rebranded to Google Podcasts now, because they're trying to emulate, I think, Apple Podcasts in a way. But when you increase your distribution too, that's also, a key component for growth and increasing your audience. And I think, talking about like, and by the way, these are all kind of more advanced strategies that I think are really, really good that we're talking about here that most people don't know. Believe it or not, They don't know. I mean, they're just like, because I've known people that are like, oh, I signed up on Anchor.fm and, I started my podcast. It's like, well, it's really more of a mini cast is what you're doing. It's not like you're full blown. So, but that goes back to the education, right? Like they don't have enough education in understanding what it takes to evolve the podcast to a point to where you could literally make a living off of just your podcast if you really wanted to.
For sure. If you can easily do that, especially if you get those listeners, then you're going to have sponsors chasing you down, and it's going to be a lot easier for the sponsor to chase you down if you are being unique. You talked a lot about being unique and different, and it takes me back to something that I try to share with clients is draw your line in the sand. I don't know if you've ever heard that, Ivan, but drawing a line in the sand. I created this like fake story about a guy named his name is UGH and he's a caveman long time ago, and he discovered fire when fire was not a thing, and a lot of the people were like fascinated about it. A lot of the other cave people were fascinated about this fire thing, but the main the main chief back then was like, no, this has got to be of the devil. This could hurt you. There's a lot of bad that could come from this. And this guy named was like, no, this is a wonderful thing. And so he draws a line in the sand and he just shows like that's what they do. And this is like the new way. Once you can be unique and different and you literally draw that line in the sand,
Yep.
you will have people that prefer you over the current chief, even if there's only one thing. There's no reason to follow somebody else who's saying the exact same thing. You got to draw your line in the sand to be able to show what you do differently. And I think that's a piece that gets missed by a lot of new podcasters is they are, like you said, they're following along suit. They're just doing what they've seen before. You got to draw that line in the sand and become and now you can actually pull people away from what's going on now and they start following you and becoming true fans.
You know, that is so powerful because it also speaks to leadership. So true leaders lead by example, right? And what you were just talking about is the fictitious story that you've created of is a prime example of how basically was in this fictitious story en route to becoming the new leader, the new chief, right? Because and with that come repercussions, right? Because you have people in the podcasting industry that have been there for a long time and they have clout, because I know plenty of those, 50,000, 100,000 downloads per month. I've even read some that have got a couple million per month. And you're a disruption to their environment. And I'm notorious about that. One of the biggest fucking disruptors there is, and people hate that. But they hate that because they're so used to what they're doing. Like the chief, you said the chief has got his own process and operations, and comes in and it's like, no, we really need to be doing this. This is innovative. This is new. This is where we need to be going. And chief's like, no, this is not where we need to be going, because he's afraid that his authority might get stripped away. And that's what I feel like traditional podcasters, like looking at Joe Rogan, let's use him for an example. That huge Spotify deal that he got, it's like, yeah, he had built enough clout, but Joe Rogan literally almost reinvents himself every day on this podcast. He's forced to. He has to be disruptive. He has to, be doing something different, something polarizing. Like I think one of the episodes where was it Elon Musk that was on there that was smoking a cigar or something, or they were drinking, like that's like so socially cliche now. Like everybody was like, what is this billionaire doing on Joe Rogan? Because they wouldn't see it anywhere else, right? Like they wouldn't see anywhere else Elon Musk, one of the the Iron Man of modern times, so to speak, like be doing something like that cliche. So back to your story is like with traditional podcasters are like, well, I'm getting $100,000 downloads, or 100,000 downloads per month. I don't need to be doing something different. No, if you're not innovating and disrupting, you're slowly dying.
Yeah. I realized that I did that on this interview. Like ready, fire, aim. Everybody tells you, this is the norm. Ready, fire, aim. Or what was the other thing that I mentioned? If you build it, they will come. Or what's the other thing that we hear all the time? Just start. Like you can figure it out later. And it does feel like I'm really the only one saying that you got to take time to understand how this is going to go, your marketing strategy, who your avatar is, how you're going to serve them, how it correlates with your business, what is your lead magnet if you have something to give away to get people on your list. Like other people, they neglect all of that and then they have a crappy podcast. And then those people who slow down are the ones that get the success. So it is another way to draw the line in the sand. And I didn't even realize until we were starting to, really bring this out that even I am trying to intentionally be a disruptor so that people can see, the difference. They can see what's on that side of the line of the sand and on my side. And if and not everybody, some of them are going to still want to be on that side, and that's fine. They won't follow me. But like the people that are said, you know what, this is the first time I heard this. Fire could be good. Maybe I'll go on us side of the line. So I love that.
One other thing that I wanted to mention too, and the beauty about this episode is that we're both very like-minded about podcasting, and that's the beauty about this, is because when you get two like-minded people about the same topic, I mean, like the amount of creativity and ideas just flourish like crazy. It's just fucking insane. One thing I wanted to mention is pivoting. As you were talking about, that is, I think with podcasting, you have to understand the essence of pivoting. And that really also goes to entrepreneurship and business, because 2020 with this pandemic has been evident of that. In fact, the businesses that survived are the ones that learn how to pivot and get more creative. So if you want to be the disruptor and the leader in a podcasting space, in your industry, in your vertical, in your niche, pivot in a sense that do something different than what everybody else is doing. Do it in a different way, portray it in a different way. I mean, example is Joe Rogan, right? Is this time he's a podcaster, he's a comedian, he's a host, but like he's put a different definition of podcasting. It's like Howard Stern. Remember when Howard Stern like came out? And I never really was a huge fan of him, but before he even got to like XM and got that crazy ass deal, but the reason he got it is because he was different. I mean, at the core, the guy was very humble from people that, I knew that may have known him or talked to him or some association, but the guy was being so polarizing, and he knew how to be entertaining. He knew how to be disruptive. He knew how to pivot in every episode and like create the unexpected. And I feel like with podcasting, because here's what happens is, when anything is new, right? It's not disrupted. It's not mainstream, right? But when it gets absorbed by everybody else, it becomes mainstream and it becomes saturated. And I think that's where podcasting is going slowly but surely, because everybody's like, at least in the marketing space, I'm going to start a podcast, Okay, great. You're going to start a podcast about what? Like you said, back to your point, who's your audience? Who's your avatar? What are you going to talk about? How is this going to be the go-to? How are you, going to differentiate yourself? Which really kind of alludes to, really creating a marketing strategy behind it. And I'm a firm believer that in part, going back to that, is starting is good, but you still need to have some definition of starting. Like, what are you going to do? Like, don't just go and like, I'm going to register some podcast name or something, and then I'm just going to hit record, because literally I feel like a vast majority of people do just that. And they're like, hey, I just want to create a voice out there for myself. Well, that might work for a short term, but for long term, if you want to create some sustainability and longevity, you're going to have to do exactly what you mentioned, is you got to define who you're speaking to. Because not everybody's going to gravitate towards your podcast, your message, what you're talking about. And not everybody's going to want to come on your podcast, to talk to you, because they don't fit, your avatar, your buyer persona.
100%. I agree with that.
Awesome. Well, I think I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm one of those people that I'm a conversationalist, so this could probably go endlessly, especially, regarding podcasting. But just to round things off, let's tell the listeners, how can they find you if they want to connect with you out on the social, some website URLs, if they're looking for help, let's go ahead and drop those links.
Sure. Well, I'll just share at least one, which is, if they are looking to launch a podcast or grow one, then they can just go, I'm getting another website as well, but this one will always stay up. It's mypodcast.website. So it's not like a .com or a .net or .io or whatever. It's literally .website. So that's mypodcast.website. And they can see what we do. They can schedule an appointment with me, do consulting with me, launch a podcast. We can do the editing, but that's probably the best hub to go to. So I guess we'll just leave them one link. There's no reason to give them 10 different ways to chase me. If they want to find me, they can go to my podcast website.
Awesome. Adam, really enjoyed the conversation, man. Thank you so much.